The official religion of the Persian Empire in its various manifestations historically was Zoroastrianism, at least before the rise of Islam. The official religion was Zoroastrianism. The Persian Empire before that time existed in three different versions or three different manifestations. The first great Persian empire is called the Achaemenid Empire, and its dates are 552 to 330 BCE. I should point out that there is a link on the class website that says important dates, and you can look at that and you can see what dates I think are important for you to remember for test purposes. For Unit 1, I'm not looking at it right now, there are probably 10 different dates or something like that. So even if I throw around dates like the dates of the Achaemenid Empire, you don't necessarily have to know all of those dates. I'm looking at it right now. There are, let's see, maybe there's 15 dates, just years that you need to know for the first unit test. Okay, so, and the dates of these different Persian empires are not dates that you necessarily need to know. Okay. So I don't want you to get freaked out about that. Okay, so the Achaemenid Empire was the first great Persian empire, and it was founded by Cyrus the Great. You may have heard of Cyrus the Great. He's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. He is the king of Persia who allowed the Jews to return to their homeland following the Babylonian exile. So Cyrus the Great was a Persian. By nature, by birth. The Persian Empire consisted mainly of Persians, but also Medes were an important part. Medes were a different but related group of people. Remember that Zoroaster was a Mede. And the Achaemenid Empire then was founded by Cyrus the Great and lasted until it was overthrown by Alexander the Great a couple of hundred years later. Now, even though Zoroastrianism was the official religion of the Persian Empire, of the Achaemenid Empire, Cyrus and his successors allowed the subject peoples who lived among the Persians to worship their own gods. And he asked all of his people, regardless of their religion, to pray for him. In fact, Cyrus is so revered in Judaism, or ancient Israelite religion anyways, that he was called God's anointed in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1. And that word anointed is, in Hebrew, is Mashiach, which is where the word Messiah comes from. So in a sense, Cyrus was the Messiah, the anointed one of God. Cyrus's devotion to Ahura Mazda has been called into question by some historians and scholars because he took a very pragmatic approach to religion, but the same can be said of many other leaders of not only the Persian Empire, but other empires as well. Other political leaders often take pragmatic approaches to religion. Well, Cyrus and his son Cambyses were opposed by a group of priests called the Magi. The Magi were a group of Median priests, and remember that Zoroaster himself was a Mede, and so his followers would have been, eventually his followers, at least some of them, turned into these Magi. And if you've heard the word Magi before, it's because the Magi are mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament. The Magi, it doesn't say how many there were, but Magi from the East come and visit the baby Jesus right after his birth, and they give him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so the Magi were a real group of people. They were Zoroastrian priests. Okay? So I will spare you the rest of the history of the Achaemenid Empire, I think. But it's a very interesting history. Eventually, as I said, after a couple of centuries of existence, the Achaemenid Empire is overthrown by Alexander the Great and the Greeks. And at that time, the Zoroastrian sacred scriptures, called the Avesta, had been written down and existed in various places. But because of the destruction of this war with the Greeks, about 3/4 of the Avesta was actually lost at that time. And what remains today had to be reconstructed from oral tradition. So who knows what else used to be in the Avesta. It's still fairly long, but a lot of it was lost in the battles with the Greeks. At the end of the Achaemenid period, Old Persian was still the language that was the official language of the Persian Empire, and Old Persian was a descendant of the Avestan language, that is, the language the Avesta itself was written in. But the language that most people spoke, the lingua franca, was Aramaic, and this was the language that was used to communicate throughout the ancient world. And so Cyrus himself was Persian. He would have spoken Old Persian. We know this from there are Old Persian inscriptions that some of Cyrus's successors wrote on rocks, on stone, on mountains, and other monuments around. But Aramaic was the language of commerce and the language of diplomacy at that time in the ancient Near East. So after Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, you may remember that Alexander died at a very young age. He was in his early 30s. And so he didn't have a son old enough to take over. So his empire was divided among several of his generals. The general that got charge of the Persian part of the empire was named Seleucus, and he founded what's called the Seleucid Empire, which is really a Greek empire, but there was some mixture of Persian heritage. Nevertheless, the Zoroastrians and other native Persians who didn't like the Hellenization, that is the Greekization, that's not really a word, the word is Hellenization. They didn't like becoming Greeks and having to speak Greek and having to adopt Greek religious traditions. They arose against the Seleucids after a while, and this led to the establishment of a new Persian empire that was called the Arsacid Empire, otherwise known as the Parthian Empire. The Parthian Empire was the great rival to Rome during the heyday of the Roman Empire. The Parthian Empire goes from 248 BCE to 224 CE, so the Parthian Empire lasted for a good half millennium, a good 500 years. It was a period of syncretism. Syncretism means religious traditions are blended together, and the kings of the Parthians, the Arsacids, were opposed frequently by the Magi, the priests, and eventually, after 500 years or so, these Arsacids were overthrown by the more traditionalist Zoroastrians, and they established what became known as the Sasanian Empire. The Sasanian Empire was the last example of the Persian Empire, at least under Zoroastrianism. The Sasanian Empire lasted from 224 to 651 CE, and it was characterized by a restoration of traditional Zoroastrianism, persecution of those who were not Zoroastrians, including Jews, Christians, Manichaeans, and various other groups, including some so-called heretical groups within Zoroastrianism itself. So there was a movement called Zurvanism that was extremely dualistic, more dualistic even than regular Zoroastrianism, and it claimed that Zurvan, which is the Persian word for time, Zurvan was the first principle and the creator deity, and Zurvan created both Ahura Mazda and the evil Angra Mainyu as twin brothers, and they were in a constant struggle with one another, hence the dualism I mentioned. Zurvanism probably had a great impact on Manichaeism as it developed a little bit later than Zurvanism. At any rate, the Sasanian Empire was a very strongly Zoroastrian empire, but it was overthrown by Muslim invaders from the Arabian Peninsula in the year 651, and after this, the Persian territory was controlled by Muslims, and people gradually converted to Islam. Now, the Muslims didn't force people to convert to Islam right away. It was more of a gradual thing. It took place over a couple of centuries, not because they were forced at the point of the sword, but rather because, well, this was the dominant culture. If you wanted to get anywhere in society, you needed to be Muslim. And also there was a tax called the jizya that was imposed on non-Muslims in the empire. And eventually most of the Zoroastrians decided, it makes sense to convert to Islam. They're monotheistic like we are, so, might as well go along to get along. And so most of the Zoroastrians converted to Islam. Not everybody did, though. Not all of the Zoroastrians did. And some of them migrated from Persia to what is now today India. And the people, the Zoroastrians who migrated to India became known as the Parsis. The Parsi is just a word that means Persian. But there was a large Parsi community in India, and there's still a Parsi community in India to this day. And these are the descendants of the Zoroastrians, and they still practice the Zoroastrian religion. Another group remained in Persia, or Iran as it's also called, and they became known as the Iranis. And these were it was a smaller group. They tended to be less wealthy than the Parsis, and there's still a relatively small group of Zoroastrians that live today in the nation of Iran, which of course is still a Muslim nation. The Zoroastrian sacred scripture, as I've said before, is called the Avesta. It was written in the language that we call Avestan, and as I said, it's a language related to Sanskrit. And the language of the Avestan, just like the language of the Vedic scriptures in Hinduism, were written in an Indo-European language. English is an Indo-European language, so is Spanish, French, German, Italian, Latin, Greek. All of these are Indo-European languages. And you think, well, why would they speak a language related to English so far over there, even all the way to India? Well, remember, they're called Indo-European languages, and they're the languages of, not all of India, but many languages in northern India are in this branch. And Avestan, which was spoken in, as I said, was spoken in ancient Persia, its descendant is still spoken in Persia today. In Iran today, the language today is called Farsi. And Farsi is related to the word Parsi, related to the word Persia. It's an Indo-European language. It's written in Arabic script, but it's actually an Indo-European language. Okay, so the Avesta was written in this ancient cousin of Sanskrit, and it consists of various parts. The oldest parts of the Avesta, the oldest part is called the Yasna. The Yasna is primarily a liturgical collection that includes a group of hymns called the Gathas, which are attributed to Zoroaster himself. And then there are various other aspects of the Avesta, various other parts of the Avesta. Let's see. Which I will, they're in the notes. I'll let you read them in the notes. But the Vasna the Yasna rather, is the most important part of the Avesta. During a period of time, somewhat later, during the Sasanian period, really, I suppose, the language of Persia had developed into a language called Pahlavi. It's just Middle Persian. It's called Pahlavi. And extensive commentaries were written on the Avesta. We see commentaries on sacred texts as something that we find in many different religious traditions, including Judaism, Islam. We find it in Confucianism and others as well. So these extensive commentaries were actually written down after the fall of the Sasanian Empire to the Muslims in 651. Let me say a little bit more about Zoroastrianism, and then we'll close out our discussion. Zoroastrians value married life, and all the priests in Zoroastrianism, who are all male, are expected to be married. The Magi I've mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew were a class of Zoroastrian priests, and so that's a little connection to those of you who come from a Christian tradition. The Magi are mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew. The importance of fire, I've mentioned before. The Zoroastrians worship in fire temples. If you look at the video on the class website, you'll see the sacred fire that's in the fire temple of the Zoroastrians. The earth is also something that's sacred to Zoroastrians, and because both earth and fire were sacred to Zoroastrians, they had a very interesting custom for getting rid of their dead, getting rid of dead bodies. They didn't want to pollute the fire by cremating the bodies, as the Hindus do, and they didn't want to pollute the earth by burying the bodies, as many other religious traditions do, people from other religious traditions. So they had this thing called a sacred tower, and they would take the bodies to the top of a sacred tower for vultures to devour. And so over the course of a year, the vultures would come and eat the flesh off the bones, and even the bones themselves, and then that way the earth wouldn't be polluted with the bodies, and fire wouldn't be polluted with the ashes. And at the end of a year, they would go back up and sweep what remained of the bones, which usually wasn't very much, into little crevices in the sacred tower. So that practice continued up until about the middle of the 20th century, when it was finally outlawed. Seems like a very strange way to dispose of bodies, perhaps today, but it made perfectly good sense in the context of their religious beliefs. As I said, there aren't a whole lot of Zoroastrians still in the world today. Estimates range from 200,000 to 2.5 million, mostly concentrated in India and Iran, but there's also some in the U.S., Canada, and other countries. I've met one or two Zoroastrians over the years. The influence of Zoroastrianism is not so much in their continued existence as a separate religious group, but in the beliefs, some of the beliefs that they passed on to others, particularly the Western religious traditions. These are some of the beliefs that originated in Zoroastrianism and then were transferred to Judaism, and from Judaism to Christianity to Islam. So monotheism, the idea that there's only one God, originated in Zoroastrianism, and it is transferred to the other religious traditions. Now Judaism, it's true, had an idea of a main God they called Yahweh, before their encounter with Zoroastrianism, which we'll talk more about later. But this notion of absolutely only one God was a strong influence on Judaism as well. The idea of a differentiated afterlife, heaven and hell as it's called in the Western traditions, this originated with Zoroastrianism. The idea of angels and demons, that is, lesser spiritual beings that have a lot of power but aren't equal to God, this originated within Zoroastrianism. And the idea of Satan, the evil spirit, and the Holy Spirit, the good spirit, this also originates in Zoroastrianism, but then is transferred to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I believe that is all I really want to say about Zoroastrians. So we will leave it there, and we'll have some discussion this week on aspects of Zoroastrianism, some of their beliefs and practices.